This GeekWire podcast is brought to you by BECU. Stay tuned to the break as Brian Westbrook interviews BECU's Stacy Black for today's Money Hack about strategies for financial planning when your income is irregular. For more money hacks, check out geekwire.com/BECU. I think the question here isn't whether AWS and Microsoft and Google are going to be the infrastructure layer. They are. I think the question is whether they are going to be able to, and specifically Amazon and Microsoft, break out of Seattle's reputation for being just kind of the plumbing of technology. I think that is the real question here. And I think,
do they have to?
Why? Here's why. Taylor Soper, our colleague, had a really great story at the beginning of the week that kind of set the tone for Seattle Tech Week. And the question was, can Seattle own the AI era? And for me, I think one of the ingredients, and he identified this, was the role of Amazon and Microsoft. And to go further, it's the question of whether Amazon and Microsoft can set the tone at the application layer in this new era, not just at the infrastructure layer. And if it's just the infrastructure layer, I think that's fine and it's perfectly good. And it's kind of what it's been all along. But are we going to see a step change in this region's place in the technology landscape? I think that's going to require one of those companies or some other new startup totally changing the landscape of the local ecosystem with a breakout product that does all those kind of spin-off effects that we've seen with other kinds of things. Hi, and welcome to GeekWire. I'm GeekWire co-founder Todd Bishop.
And I'm GeekWire co-founder John Cook.
We are coming to you from Seattle, where we get to report each day on what's happening around us in business, technology, and innovation. What happens here matters everywhere, and every week on this show, we get to talk about some of the most interesting and important stories and trends in the news. Coming up on the podcast this week, the massive contrast between Amazon and Microsoft earnings, plus a lesson from Microsoft Zune, of all things. That's still
throwback.
A throwback for sure, but it's still relevant for today.
You still have yours, Todd?
You know what? My Zune got stolen in one of the...
one of our break-ins. Yeah, That's right. Somebody stole the Zune. We should reflect. During COVID, our offices got broken into, I think, 3 times.
I think it was 5.
A lot. Yes.
I think it was maybe the second or third break-in that they finally said, I'll take that little piece of brown turd.
Awesome.
Plus, why Microsoft's AI chief believes its Copilot assistant might become so personal that it could age and have a room of its own. All that coming up. But John, I got to say, just framing everything we're going to talk about here, this week felt to me like peak AI. Just a massive week with Microsoft earnings,
Amazon earnings,
Microsoft briefly reaching a $4 trillion valuation, only the second company to ever do that behind NVIDIA. These massive talent wars. You know, we broke the story a couple of weeks ago about the local startup founder, Matt Dietke, who got recruited for hundreds of millions of dollars by Meta to join their super intelligence team. And the New York Times followed up on that this week with a little bit more color and some of the specifics about his pay package. And so to me, it just feels like it's so frothy. And I worry a bit that it might be too frothy in some ways, that there might not be as much substance behind all of this as people may think, but that's a whole other issue. It just feels like for now, this is peak AI. And I wanted to play for you, just as a representation of that fact, some clips from the Microsoft earnings call, but not Satya Nadella or Amy Hood, rather the analyst reactions to Microsoft earnings. So let's listen to that now.
Thank you guys for taking the question, and congratulations on a fantastic end to FY25. I've been covering Microsoft for a while. I don't think I've ever seen a quarter where everything came together this well.
I didn't know how you were going to beat last quarter, and you did it, so congratulations.
The magnitude of upside, I think, had shocked many here.
So it's like, if you're a public company CEO, especially at a scale of Microsoft, I can imagine that it might be a little nerve-wracking heading into the analyst calls, thinking, God, any word you could say might send the market one way or another. But here you got especially after the month that Satya Nadella has had in Redmond with 15,000 total layoffs over the past few months, you can imagine that him going into this call with the blockbuster earnings that they had, and basically they just beat across the board, revenue, profits, everything was higher than Wall Street expected based on their AI strength. He might want to be moving to New York at this point.
Don't see that in the cards. No. He seems like he'll take the Wall Street accolades, but at the end of the day, he's a product guy.
He is.
And he's a guy who wants to build the best technology, right? Which is why these analysts are effusive.
Exactly.
So,
just the contrast between what he's dealing with at home, as it were.
Yeah, that's an interesting contrast. We'll talk more about that because you've been covering the contrast, the disparity, this number of layoffs we're seeing versus the record results. Are they tied together at all?
Oh, so that is what gets really interesting, because I think over the years, when we've talked about the impact of AI on jobs, we've always said, it's going to be productivity. In other words, inside the office, inside the workforce, people are going to be getting so much efficiency from AI over time that companies don't need to employ as many people. And certainly that is still happening. It's still on the horizon to some extent. But what we're seeing right now with Microsoft, especially as a symbol of all this, is that it's more that the company needs to show investors that it's being disciplined on costs at the operating expense level, headcount, because it's spending so much on capital expenses. It's almost like this tribute that it's paying to Wall Street, saying, hey, we're going to cut tens of thousands or thousands of jobs, and therefore we want you to give us the leeway to spend billions of dollars to expand our AI infrastructure.
Yeah, it's interesting, Todd. As you know, I host a number of these dinners around town with executives. This week, I happen to have a dinner with chief information security officers.
Oh, wow.
And so obviously AI was a big topic. What was interesting, and we had some older school companies around the table. So some financial services, some in healthcare, and at a high level, so an executive level. What was interesting to me was that the CISOs weren't necessarily that excited about AI themselves. I mean, this creates a lot of problems for them, right?
Yes,
like managing these new systems, figuring out how all these agents are going to talk to one another. There's all sorts of security issues, and so they're cautious. But what was interesting, at least two of the folks around the table said they were getting a lot of pressure from their board about AI. And this ties into this. This isn't necessarily a bubbling. To your point, Wall Street wants to see this. The board wants to see the efficiencies. It's almost a financial discussion because they can get these efficiencies and the stock price will go up as a result, not necessarily just the product is driving this. So I think the two are connected in a very interesting way, but maybe a story for us to look into is how boards are looking at AI and pressuring the executives to implement it, have the AI strategy, cut costs, in this case with Microsoft.
So fascinating that you say that. And there's been so many threads that I've been picking up on from the podcasts over the past few weeks. And this is one example. Francesca Vasquez from the AWS Generative AI Innovation Center. One of the things she said was that the companies that are most aggressive on pushing AI projects from prototype to production are the ones that have really cutting edge board members who are thinking about what AI could do for the company.
That's interesting because one of the companies that was there, and I'm not going to mention names, they had a former security leader from Microsoft on the board who it came up in the discussion. That is the person that's pushing them towards AI.
Wait, what do you mean?
Well, they had a board member who's very big on AI who happens to be a former Microsoft person
on this company's board. This unnamed company's board, not Microsoft.
That's pushing them to adopt AI in a much faster manner. And that's one of the reasons why the chief information security officer is like saying, oh gosh, I guess I gotta look at this a little closer, even though there's reluctance for them to do it.
That's so fascinating because one of the things that made Microsoft's month so eventful was the SharePoint server flaw. And so at the same time, you have this company investing billions, tens of billions of dollars. I mean, Microsoft's investment for this current quarter, is going to be $30 billion. So like $120 billion if you annualize that. And here you have the SharePoint server issue, and like how much more could they make their software secure if they invested at least a slice? Now, that's not fair. You know, they've got their Secure Future initiative. Charlie Bell is running that, former AWS. Obviously, they're trying. It's a big, hairy challenge, but you've got all this legacy software. SharePoint server, the ones that were hit were not cloud. It was on
and so there
premises.
really isn't an AI tech story tied into that hack, as far as we know.
No, except for the fact that Microsoft's attention is elsewhere right now. Microsoft's attention is on cloud and AI. And here, coincidentally perhaps, but their latest big hack was on on-premises software.
Well, didn't Amazon CEO Andy Jassy indirectly reference that in his earnings call?
Yes, talked about the number 2 player.
Yeah, having some security problems or issues.
If you look at what matters to customers, what they care a lot about what the operational performance is, you know, what the availability is, what the durability is, what the latency and throughput is of the various services. And I think we have a pretty significant advantage in that area. They care a lot about security. If you have data that matters, and for most companies, they're putting data that they really care about in the cloud, the security and the privacy of that data matters a lot. And there are very different results in security in AWS than you'll see in other players. And yeah, you just look at what's happened the last couple months. You can just see kind of adventures at some of these players almost every month. And so very big difference, I think, in security. And then I think a really significant difference in functionality.
It's funny to hear how Amazon does that because they don't want to call it out directly to the extent that somebody could come back and call them out on it when they have a hack, because everybody's going to have security problems. Granted, Microsoft's security problems seem at least disproportionate in terms of the number and the severity of the impact.
Well, they have more software out in the world, I would say, than probably Amazon does. I don't know.
They do.
Historically, I think that's the case, and that's their argument, right? That we're targeted because we have so much more software in play at all these different organizations.
They do. So that was one interesting area too during the earnings where Microsoft talked about the number of Copilot users that they have, the number of monthly active users across commercial and consumer offerings for Copilot surpassing 100 million monthly active users. And so to your point, like Microsoft has a big presence with Windows, but if you want to compare that, for example, to Google said its Gemini app now has more than 450 million monthly active users. They announced that last week. So 100 million versus 450 million. So you're talking about Microsoft's presence, and certainly on the back end, the infrastructure, the cloud, the servers, Microsoft is huge. But when you compare Windows, which is where that 100 million monthly active users really comes from, to Chrome and Android, which is where that Gemini number comes from, you know, Microsoft's presence on the front end is not nearly as large as Google's. Just tons of interesting stuff coming out. As I was covering Microsoft earnings, one of the thoughts that struck me was, you know, I used to really focus on Windows OEM licensing sales and, you know, Office commercial and Office consumer and stuff. And like the metrics that I'm paying attention to now that I'm plugging into our spreadsheets and generating graphics from, totally different. Completely different world. And it's just another symptom of how much things have changed.
Well, Wall Street seems to like it, at least in the case of Microsoft.
Yeah, and they came down a little bit from the 4 trillion.
Yeah, I think it was 3.9 trillion last I checked.
Yeah.
Well, an analyst was just on CNBC, I think it was,
Dan
this
Ives.
week. Yeah, who was talking about Microsoft being a $5 trillion company next year.
Dan Ives
Like,
is so
can you
funny.
just add another $1 trillion to their market value in a year? For doing what?
If somebody hasn't profiled Dan Ives from Wedbush, they need to. This guy wears like the most, you know, Grateful Dead psychedelic outfits on CNBC. And he always has these analogies that he uses. And his current favorite one is that Microsoft is the Scotty Scheffler of software.
Why don't we have him on the podcast?
Oh, I'd love to. We should. Yeah. We had Colin Sebastian from Baird, who was great, who has some really good questions on the Amazon call.
And he has to dress in his, his crazy suit.
Dan does. Yeah. But that would be a good follow-up and perhaps a contrast to the Colin Sebastian podcast. Okay. Speaking of contrasts, Amazon's earnings call, totally different story. So
you should play the reactions of the analysts on that one.
Let's do that.
Oh, okay. You're going to. I got that set up for me. Good. Okay.
That's coming up next. You're listening to GeekWire.
I'm Brian Westbrook with GeekWire Studios. Money Hacks presented by BECU. On this episode, we're talking about those with irregular sources of income. Now, what does that mean, Stacey Black?
Yeah, it could be if you do freelance work, contract, or seasonal work. It's whenever you don't have income that's a regular, steady amount that you can expect.
And that means a lot of challenges, everything from healthcare to how to save. You've got a lot of great tips in this episode of Money Hacks. We'll check it out at geekwire.com/BECU. I'm Brian Westbrook, joined by Stacey Black, lead financial educator for BECU. Check it out.
Listen to the full interview and find more episodes of Money Hacks at geekwire.com/BECU and find more information at becu.org. Welcome back. So we're recapping a big week in the Seattle tech world, in the world of AI, in the world of technology globally. And we just talked about Microsoft and the reaction that a lot of the analysts had. So John, I don't have a parade of analysts to show you here, but there was one analyst question that I thought was very telling. This was Morgan Stanley analyst Brian Nowak setting up his question for Amazon CEO Andy Jassy on the company's earnings call.
Andy, I have two for you on AWS. They're a little tough, but I'm gonna throw them at you. So,
what do you think he's going to ask?
Oh, that's it? That's all you're going to give me?
There's going to be more. There's going to be more. I just want to pause
little
there.
tough. Well, I read your story, so I think it's going to be talk about the Wall Street narrative of why you're missing the ball on AI.
It is.
Okay.
It is. But I just want to stop it there before I kept playing it because it's like, compare that.
Yeah, it's a little not as congratulatory.
Andy Jassy is not thinking about moving to New York, even though he's from New York. He's I'm staying in Seattle. I'm staying far away from Wall Street. Okay, here's the rest of the question.
There is a Wall Street finance person narrative right now that AWS is falling behind in Gen AI with concerns about share loss to peers, et cetera. Can you just sort of address that? What is your rebuttal to that? And talk to us about your and the team's most important focal points, just to ensure that AWS stays on the knife's edge of innovation versus hyperscaler peers. And then secondly, I know AWS is a big business, but is there any reason to assume it shouldn't accelerate in the back half and into 26, given the size of the opportunity and all of the Gen AI capabilities going to sort of come to us in the next 12 months?
Okay, so that was the question. And I would play for you Andy Jassy's response in its entirety, but our podcast would be over because he went for about
let's summarize key
7
points.
minutes 45 seconds.
So this is obviously a hot button issue, right?
Basically, he said that AI is still in its early stages. They're seeing a top heavy market with a few large frontier models and applications like ChatGPT and coding agents doing well, while most other AI applications are still in pilot mode. He emphasized that the real game changer will be inference costs. In other words, training at the beginning versus inference, actually running the models. He says those will represent 80 to 90% of AI expenses at scale. So in other words, that's where Amazon's going to make its money. And they're betting on custom silicon like Trainium for better price performance. This is their custom AI chip.
Their own chips. Yeah.
And that'll make it easier to build and deploy AI agents. And then he got to what I thought was really interesting.
I still think it's very early days in AI and in terms of adoption. But the other thing I would just say is that, remember, because we're at a stage right now where so much of the activity is training and figuring out how to get your generative AI applications into production, people aren't paying as close attention as they will in making sure that those generative AI applications are operating where the rest of their data and infrastructure is. Remember, a lot of generative AI inference is just going to be another building block like compute, storage, and database. And so people are going to actually want to run those applications close to where their other applications are running, where their data is. There's just so many more applications and data running in AWS than anywhere else that I'm very optimistic about as we get to a bigger scale what's going to happen for AWS on the AI side. And I think we have a set of services that is unique top to bottom in the stack.
In other words, because people are running so many workloads already, they have so much of their data already in the Amazon cloud that it's going to be just easier for them to shift into AI on AWS versus doing it in other places.
This is what stood out to me as well, because it's a classic Amazon play. You reference it's just another building block. This idea, and where Amazon has excelled is that they have operated as a low margin or a lower margin business in technology. So if it's a race to the bottom on AI, and I'm not saying it is, but if that's the play, then Amazon does have strategic advantages there because it operates really well when margins shrink and it plays in that world. So I don't know if it's going to play out that way, but I can see where he's coming from.
I agree. It sounded to me, though, like a bit of the incumbent's refrain. In other words, if all else fails, we've got our legacy business and it's going to see us through into this next generation. And that does not feel to me like a winning formula. Now, tons of caveats here, though. Let me just, because the Amazon people are screaming at me right now if they're listening. Yeah. Amazon has Alexa Plus. They've got this new thing called Kiro. They've got their own models. They've got Bedrock. I mean, they've got tons of strengths here. But the fact that Andy Jassy focused in part on that legacy was a red flag for me.
But the reason Microsoft's been successful in both the cloud and AI is because of its legacy business too, because it has the built-in sales force with the representation with the biggest companies around the world, which is where Amazon hasn't had as much success historically in that. And Microsoft is now trading on that to leverage it into cloud and AI. So I would say it's not a bad strategy. It's worked for Microsoft. So what's the difference between Microsoft doing it and Amazon doing it?
Fair enough. Absolutely. I would say a couple things. First off, neither of them, I think, has yet proved itself in the realm of AI applications.
Well, this also leads to the idea that maybe it won't be Amazon or Microsoft.
Yes.
In fact, this is such a game-changing technology that only a newcomer will come in and emerge and blow up the system.
I think you've got to distinguish in that kind of comment, though, between the layer of the stack that you're talking about. I think at the infrastructure level, I think there is very little that others can do at this point to challenge.
Can OpenAI build 700 data centers around the world? And
perhaps with their SoftBank and Oracle partnership.
Maybe, but it's going to take some time and effort and a lot of money to do that.
There's a reason that OpenAI is partnering with Microsoft and that Anthropic is partnering with Amazon.
Right.
So you've got the infrastructure. I think Google, Microsoft, and Amazon are clearly in the lead there. My question is, are you going to see a breakout application from any of these? And that, to me, is the big question.
Just taking this a step further then back to the original kind of PC era, then do Amazon and Microsoft just become kind of the dumb infrastructure, and they're the place that hosts it, and all the innovation is the software of the OpenAI and the Anthropics that's running through it? And this is essentially how Microsoft became Microsoft, right? They took advantage of everyone thinking it was just going to be the hardware manufacturers that own the world, and Microsoft came in and said, nope, it's software.
Exactly.
So is AI just another piece of software or is it a massive technological shift? I think most people think a lot of people think it's a massive technological shift that's different than the software revolution.
That's along the lines of the software revolution. Yeah. And I think Bill Gates, when I got to talk with him, not to name drop, but one of the things...
Hey, I know you hang out with them down in Palm Springs all the time.
One of the things he made a point of saying was that what powered the personal computer revolution was computing becoming effectively free. And now what you're seeing is intelligence becoming effectively free. And I kind of like to think of it that way. But to your point on the infrastructure, I think the question here isn't whether AWS and Microsoft and Google are going to be the infrastructure layer. They are. I think the question is whether they are going to be able to, and specifically Amazon and Microsoft, break out of Seattle's reputation for being just kind of the plumbing of technology. I think that is the real question here. And I think,
do they have to?
Why? Here's why. Taylor Soper, our colleague, had a really great story at the beginning of the week that kind of set the tone for Seattle Tech Week. And the question was, can Seattle own the AI era? And for me, I think one of the ingredients, and he identified this, was the role of Amazon and Microsoft. And to me, to go further, it's the question of whether Amazon and Microsoft can set the tone at the application layer in this new era, not just at the infrastructure layer. And if it's just the infrastructure layer, I think that's fine and it's perfectly good. And it's kind of what it's been all along. But are we going to see a step change in this region's place in the technology landscape? I think that's going to require one of those companies or some other new startup totally changing the landscape of the local ecosystem with a breakout product that does all those kind of spin-off effects that we've seen with other kinds of things.
Do Microsoft or Amazon have anything like that in the pipeline that you think could be that?
Microsoft would argue that it's Copilot. Amazon would say things like Alexa Plus. There was a really interesting product, and I need to follow up on this. I'm kind of workshopping some stories here with you.
Yeah, no, I love doing that. That's what the podcast is for, at least for us.
So one of the stories is this question of owning the infrastructure, but not yet getting into the application layer really in a meaningful way of AI. And the other one is this product that Amazon came out with a few weeks ago called Kiro, which is a vibe coding product that also integrates documentation and schemas. And I've been hearing some things, and maybe this is tipping my hand a bit. I've been getting some tips that it is doing extremely well. That it's to the point that they're having to throttle with developers, to the point that they're having to throttle some of the usage, that it's like impacting Amazon internally because so much of the bandwidth is going toward Kiro. Now, I need to look into this. This was one tip that I got from one anonymous person on Signal. But it was a legit, it was like it had the feel of a legit tip. I'll move on now.
Well, it's at least an interesting trend to look at.
Okay, coming up next, I got some fun stuff for you. We'll be right back. Welcome back. It's Todd Bishop with John Cook. One of the things I've been really enjoying doing over the weekends, over the past few weeks, as I'm doing chores, is catching up on some podcasts, some long podcasts that I just didn't have time to listen to before. And one of them is from TIE Seattle, local entrepreneurial group. They did their own Microsoft at 50 podcast series. Of course, we went to town on this as well, but they went back and they talked to several executives. And the reason I really keyed in on it was some of them were people I didn't get a chance to talk to for our series that I wanted to. Paul Moritz, the former head of platforms at Microsoft, Jeff Rakes, former head of Microsoft Office, and Robbie Bach, who was the head of entertainment and devices and Xbox. And Robbie had some really fascinating comments on Microsoft Zune, why it failed and why Xbox succeeded. And
well, we should say, for those that are maybe under the age of 35, what Zune is.
Zune was Microsoft's attempt to challenge the iPod. And Robbie...
And now what was an iPod?
Oh, come on. No. It was Microsoft's music player. It was a music device. And Robbie had some really interesting comments on the From Startup to Exit podcast from TIE Seattle here that provided some larger business lessons and actually tied into some of the discussions we're having today.
I think there was a number of challenges in Zune and a number of successes. I kind of have to catalog both of those. Zune was designed to deal with the fact that we had all these Windows media players out there, none of whom were gaining traction against Apple and none of whom who were successful. And truthfully, if we're honest, the experience on those players was nothing like the experience on an iPod. And the reason it wasn't as good is because you had nobody organizing the total consumer experience, right? You had the Windows experience on top of another piece of software on another piece of external hardware that was all kind of glommed together. And the seams showed. There are cracks in the experience, and the experience just wasn't very good. So we had this discussion about, well, to make the experience good, we have to do it ourselves. And again, the decision was made that, having iPod control what was going on in the music space wasn't good for Microsoft long term, and so hence Zune was born. Now, why did Zune not succeed? Couple things. One, we were very late. Two, in the gaming space, Sony made a number of mistakes with PlayStation 3 that we were able to take advantage of. Honestly, Apple executed like a machine. They just didn't make any mistakes. They didn't leave us a crack to get in there. And three, we made some big bets in that space, and the bets were good bets and mistimed. So as an example, we bet on a subscription music service. And the Zune subscription service was like 5 years before Spotify. And it was a really good idea. And the music labels weren't ready for it. Consumers, frankly, weren't quite ready for that. This was right in the heat of iTunes being successful and people buying 99-cent songs. So the idea that you would buy a subscription and pay for that every month and consume your music that way just wasn't quite ready. Leave aside the hardware for a second. The Zune player was a great player and had a really nice user interface, was really good. And it was Spotify before Spotify. And, you know, that team, the software team should be really proud. The hardware team did great work. They were just, you know, constantly chasing Apple's great work, which was really hard. There's a timing factor and a business model factor and an ecosystem factor there that just worked against us. And being late made it worse. It's one of the things, in my reflection on my time at Microsoft, it's one of the things that I gets underrated, which is timing really is everything.
So that was Robbie Bach, and it was just kind of a fun throwback, but I also thought it was really interesting, the comments that he made about how they were able to compete against Sony. And for people who don't know, the original Xbox had an Ethernet port. And so the whole idea was Microsoft was laying the groundwork for online gaming, and that's really why the Xbox was able to even be competitive against the Switch and Sony, was that competitive differentiation. And obviously Sony and the PlayStation and Nintendo are still market leaders, but Microsoft is a player as well, and you can see where that had a big impact. And just the timing. And this to me was a big story of Microsoft in this era was just bad timing. Too early, too late, and very rarely in the sweet spot of the right moment. And so this now is making me think about Copilot. And Mustafa Suleyman, Microsoft's CEO of AI, who joined the company back in 2024, he was recently on another podcast that I listened to, the Colin and Samir show. I don't know if you're familiar with these guys. YouTubers, really interesting. All the questions were a lot about content and media. It actually would be really good for you to listen to. I think you'd enjoy it. Here's Mustafa Suleyman on the Colin and Samir show talking about Copilot.
That's one thing I'm very, very excited about. But I'm also excited about like the visual appearance. Like Copilot will certainly have a kind of permanent, you know, identity, a presence, and it will have a room that it lives in, and it will age. You know, I'm really interested in this idea of digital patina. The things I love in my world are the things that are a little bit worn and rubbed down and have got scuff marks, and, you know, and that makes it feel like it's mine. And unfortunately, in the digital world at the moment, we don't have a sense of age. We don't have any kind of sense that something, you know, has temporality at all, actually. It's sort of in an infinite space. And that's quite alien as a concept to most of us, to all of us, really, is the infinity. And so I'm very interested in, like, I hate my desktop, you know? I look at my screen and I'm like, shit, man, I have a billboard in front of me. It's just like so noisy. It's so neon. It's all competing for my attention. You know, like it just looks ugly. And I kind of want like a quieter, simpler, cleaner working environment that is optimized for all the things that I'm interested in, all the things I want to get done.
Copilot will
Sounds
age.
like Microsoft Bob, doesn't it?
Oh my God, I didn't even think of that. It does.
It sounds like Microsoft Bob to me.
So it's funny you should say that because I love...
We're going to the historical bank here with Zune and
yeah.
Bob. Hopefully people are still with us.
I love listening to Mustafa Suleyman talk about, like, conceptually what's going to happen, how he thinks about it. You know, I'm reading his book. I'm going back and reading The Coming Wave, listening to the audiobook, which was his book from a couple years ago before he joined Microsoft. But I got to say, is that the approach that he's taking to product development right now? I think it is.
Well,
And it's one
and
of
we
the
know
reasons,
what happened with Microsoft Bob.
It's one of the well, not even in a very literal way, but just kind of the conceptual approach and the high-minded.
It's very philosophical.
It sounds so much more to me like Microsoft research than it does Microsoft R&D, product development. And I wonder, like, okay, yeah, that may be where we're going to be in 10 years, but in the meantime, like, put something out there that's not just an also ran. And later on in this podcast, it really blew me away. They did this demo of Copilot podcasts where they're able to take your source material and turn them into AI generated hosted podcasts.
Well, it's very much what Notebook LM does, right?
It was like, and I don't know if Colin and Samir were being polite or what, but nobody brought up the fact that this is something Google's done for, more than a year now.
And speaking to our earlier conversation about how you feel Microsoft or Amazon need to have this AI-enabled application that comes out that's game-changing, I guess you have some doubts that they're going to be able to get there.
I'm not seeing it. I'm trying to use Copilot as part of my mix. I was joking last week with Brad Anderson about the triumvirate, the brethren, ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini, and I try to throw Copilot in there as the fourth disciple, and it's just not happening for me. It does these weird things.
Because you're on a PC too.
I am on a PC.
So I would think there would be advantages, right?
They came out just this week with a new Copilot Edge integration where it basically turns it into an AI browser. I have to admit, after about an hour, I turned it off. It just wasn't. I'd gotten used to the sidebar. The new implementation was weird. It wasn't doing what I wanted, and I'm like, I'll just do this later. I mean, that's not the reaction you want.
Which means never.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Okay. Tim Ellis. Remember Tim Ellis?
Sure.
The Tim?
Yes.
Longtime real estate blogger and tech guy, electrical engineer. He's hosted the podcast with us in the past. So he had a really interesting comment based on some recent discussions we've been having about ChatGPT becoming a driver of e-commerce. It came up with Colin Sebastian from Baird. It came up with Brad Anderson last week from Qualtrics. And Tim had a fascinating experience. I'll just read his text to me. He said, in your latest podcast, you made a passing mention of ChatGPT becoming a major driver of e-commerce. Well, it's not just e-commerce. We took a road trip down the coastal highway a couple of weeks ago and went to this kitschy roadside attraction in Oregon called Prehistoric Gardens. It's basically a walking trail through a forested area with giant life-size dinosaurs.
Are they real?
Not yet.
Maybe that's a good place for the Pacific Science Center's animatronic dinosaurs to go. They're getting rid of them, right?
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay. So, long story short, at the end, they had a pen and paper guest book that he signed. And one of the columns asked, how did you hear about us? And Tim writes, it cracked me up to see ChatGPT on the list. I thought he took a picture of the guest book for me, and I thought you'd appreciate the fact that you've got this really old school thing with the guest book and ChatGPT really making its presence known. I think perhaps on earlier pages you would look and you would see Google instead, and that's the change that we're seeing.
We should bring a feature to the podcast, Todd, where we say one of the most absurd things we used ChatGPT to find out in the past week.
All right, John, this is a specific recommendation for you.
Okay.
But it's also a good recommendation for others in the audience, I think.
Okay.
One of the podcasts that I went back and listened to recently was Rich Barton, the Expedia and Zillow co-founder, on Tim Ferriss, the Tim Ferriss podcast. It's a long one. I think it's more than 2 hours. But it's one of those where you just kind of get to immerse yourself in the world of Rich Barton. And for folks who know him, he's just a really inspiring leader, and a lot of it was new to me. And actually it changed my morning routine in a very specific way that maybe I can share on a future podcast after you get a chance to listen to it.
Okay, I will listen to it, and then we'll have Rich back, and you can talk to him about
that would be great.
it. Yeah.
That'd be great.
He's been a frequent guest on the podcast.
He has, absolutely. And then I'd also really recommend a lot of the coverage this week by GeekWire editor Taylor Soper from Seattle Tech Week, and not just the walk-up piece that he did about Seattle's place in the AI boom, but also some of the specific coverage he did, including a really fascinating piece Friday morning, talking to people about the AI tools that they're using, but not just that, the value that they're getting from them, And it, to me, again, was something that was actionable. I was able to look at that and go, I'm going to try that and perhaps change my routine in a meaningful way.
Well, it's been a big week between Seattle Tech Week, all the earnings, all the news. How are you hanging in there?
I'm doing great. I'm energized. You can
Seems like
probably
you're
tell.
pumped up. Yeah. And we got a lot of story ideas just out of this podcast. So.
Yeah, next week's going to be even bigger.
Yeah, that's right.
Now that I actually have time to sit down and sift through things. And, you know.
Yeah, and we're in August, so typically things slow down a little bit. So maybe you can give a little more thought to some of these story ideas.
Absolutely. Hey, thanks for listening, everybody. We will be back next week with a very special guest, Ed Lazowska from the University of Washington, talking about a milestone in his career and reflecting on the past few decades in Seattle and the tech world more broadly. Until then, I'm Todd Bishop.
And I'm John Cook.
Thanks for listening to the GeekWire podcast.